Hello, my name is Landon Smith. I am the intern here at the Plateau Discovery Gardens in Crossville, and today I'll be talking to you about basic flower morphology, pollination, and fruit development. Flowering plants use many of the same parts to reproduce, and first and most obviously we have the petals here, and those are used mainly just to attract the pollinator to your plant. And then located underneath you have your sepals, and those are used mainly for protection. And this portion of the flower right here is called the receptacle, and that is the point of attachment for your flower. It keeps everything held together. And now for your reproductive parts of your flower. Here in the center you have the stamen. It's made up of the filament and the anthers, and this is where your pollen is produced, as you can see. And then deep inside of the flower you have the female portion called the pistil, and it is made up of a stigma, which is this portion here that kind of sticks out, the style, and the ovary way down deep inside. Now that you know the basic parts of the flower, let's talk about how they work. The flowers come in many different shapes, sizes, and colors, as you know. And this isn't just so they will look pretty in our gardens or anything. This is so that they will appeal to the forces which pollinate them, so that they can grow and survive. Pollination, in short, is when the pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma of another plant, and this happens many different ways in nature. One of the ways you're probably most familiar with is bee pollination. Bee pollinated flowers are typically tubular in shape, and they're usually yellow or blue, and they have many stamens. So what happens is when a bee lands on the flower, the pollen is rubbed off all over the bee, and when that bee moves on to a next other flower, it transfers that pollen onto the stigmas of the next flower, and the pollination process is complete. Another common pollinator of your flowers are hummingbirds. And hummingbird pollinated flowers are typically long and narrow. They're also usually red or orange. Birds seem to be attracted to those colors. And these flowers will produce a very sweet smelling nectar. And the stamens of these flowers are positioned so that the pollen will rub off onto the forehead of the hummingbird. And as the hummingbird continues to feed on the nectar of different flowers, it will transfer that pollen and complete the pollination process. Although butterflies and moths appear to be pretty similar, they actually have pretty different pollination strategies. Butterflies pollinate brightly colored flowers, typically during the daytime, and moths are nocturnal, so they'll usually pollinate at nighttime. And because of this, moth-pollinated flowers are not brightly colored. They're usually white or dull, and they have to produce a strong odor to attract the moth. Lastly, wind plays a huge role in pollination as well. Wind-pollinated flowers are dull and drab in color since they do not have to attract the pollinator, and they typically have long dangling anthers that produce lots of pollen, and likewise the stigmas are also long. An example of a wind pollinated flower is corn. The part of corn that we typically refer to as the silks is actually the stigma of the corn. And each individual stigma is connected to an ovary, and which in corn we refer to that as the kernel. Once pollination has occurred, your plant will begin to produce fruit, and there are two main classes of fruits, fleshy and dry fruits. And those terms are used to describe fruits at maturity. So your fleshy fruits would include things like berries, watermelons, peaches and apples, etc. And your dry fruits would include things like your grains, your beans, and corn, acorns, stuff like that. If we compare this tomato fruit and this tomato flower, you can see on the bottom of this fruit, you'll still see the remainder of the pistil, which is still here in this inside the tomato flower. So what happened was, as the pollen landed on your pistil of the flower, it became fertilized and the ovary began to enlarge into this tomato fruit. And then if you compare the top of the plant, you'll see the calyx of the fruit is also the same as the calyx of your flower. As I mentioned earlier, there are many different fruit types, and three of the most common are simple, aggregate, and multiple. And an example of a simple fruit would be this tomato. It just arises from a single flower with a single ovary. And an example of an aggregate fruit would be a blackberry, and it arises from a single flower with multiple ovaries, which is evident here inside of the blackberry flower. So if you look at the bulbs on the blackberry itself, that's actually an enlarged pistil of each ovary from the original flower. The last type of fruit is a multiple fruit, and it develops from multiple independent flowers that become fused over time. And an example of this would be a pineapple, which is evident if you look at its outer covering, all the honeycomb-like appearance. That's just where there were individual flowers and they became fused over time into one fruit. Okay, now to dispel some common misconceptions about fruits and vegetables. It seems that the public seems to think that a fruit is anything that tastes sweet, whereas a vegetable is not. And that's not exactly true. The definition of a fruit is a mature ovary that contains seeds. And vegetable comes from the vegetative part of the plant, such as your roots or your stems and leaves. So if you think about it, a pepper and corn and a tomato are all actually fruits. And a vegetable would be like your lettuce or potatoes, because lettuce is actually just leaves and potatoes are just an underground stem. My name is Landon Smith. Thank you for joining me